Okay, so I have with me here today Dr. Keith Wilkinson. He worked as an anaesthetist and had a lengthy career in medicine over several decades. He's also an author and has particular interest and experience in miscarriages of justice, and I would say just court cases in the legal system generally. I'm not going to give you an enormous biography today because we're going to talk about his background at the start of this interview. So I'll just simply say hello to Keith and thanks for joining us.
Hi, Chris. Thanks for inviting me.
It's my absolute pleasure. So, as we just mentioned, you have a background in medicine. You've worked as an anaesthetist. You worked in as a doctor for many years. Um, you have, I think it's reasonable to say, a slightly unusual background for a doctor. So, could you tell us firstly a little bit about your background and upbringing and what that
Uh,
was like?
yeah, so I was born in my grandmother's house in a coal mining village in County Durham called Stanley. So that's where I've always kind of considered myself to come from because my grandparents and my parents and all my uncles and cousins, everyone lived in and around Stanley. But a few weeks after I was born, we moved to another small mining village called Sacriston. And my parents lived there until for the rest of their lives, really. So that's where I grew up. So my dad was a coal miner then for about 10 years. All my uncles were coal miners, both grandfathers were coal miners. Um, so I'd always wanted to be a doctor from a fairly young age. I remember when at the junior school talking about it. And I remember at the secondary school going to a careers night with my parents, and I heard a GP talking about his career as a doctor. So I always, wanted to be a doctor, but when I got to A levels, um, I started to have second thoughts then because it was hard. I thought A levels was a big step up from O levels. I'd failed physics at O level, and felt that I really needed that to get it because in those days it was all well, probably similar now. It was mainly science, A levels that were interested in. Anyway, I failed physics O level, and then I struggled a bit generally in the first, say, 6 months of A levels. And I remember, so I kind of lost a bit of interest in pursuing a career as a doctor, but I went to see the careers teacher. And I remember him saying, I've never heard this expression before at the time, maybe you need to lower your sights a bit, he said. And he mentioned possibly being a medical lab technician. So I'd still be working in the hospital, but it wouldn't be as a doctor. So anyway, I went for an interview as a medical lab technician in the Navy, the Royal Navy. I went down to Portsmouth, Haslar Hospital, Gosport, and I had an interview there. And during the interview, I remember the man who interviewed me, I think was in charge of the path lab there. And he said, what do you he must have sensed something. I don't know what it was, but he said, what do you really want to do, as a career? And I said, well, I've always wanted to be a doctor. So he said, why don't you get stuck in, and have a good go at A levels. And if you still want to come in the Navy, you can come in, while you're at medical school. Anyway, all the way back on the train, I remember thinking on the train I was 17 then, on the way back to Durham on the train via London, change at London back up to. I was thinking about possibly turning over a new leaf and getting some proper studying done. And then the next morning, I went to see the form teacher and said, look, I think I'm going to start having a serious attempt at studying. And then from then on, I kind of studied really hard and, my friends wondered what was going on because I used to go out drinking every night with them and just playing cards all day in the library instead of doing what I'm supposed to be doing. So from then on, I kind of just worked really hard. I had to drop back a year in the sixth form because I'd wasted a lot of the first year. And even after 3 years in the sixth form, I still didn't get a place at medical school. So the next thing I did, I got a job as a nursing assistant in a care home for people of all ages with learning difficulties. My sister got me that job. She was a medical secretary at that place. Anyway, I got that job for the summer holidays initially, but I still couldn't get into medical school through clearing. So I asked if I could work there for a year, and it was a great job. I really enjoyed that. And then I managed to get a firm offer in December of that year. That was 1976. I got an offer to start in Liverpool as a medical student. So that was a bit about the kind of build up to medical school. I started there in October 77, and I spent 5 years in Liverpool as a medical student. And then I went to the Isle of Man to do my first job as a doctor, house officer. I didn't know, I'd never been to the Isle of Man in my life, but I went there on the Saturday, started on the Monday. And it was a great job for a house officer because you did things there that maybe my friends in Liverpool, most of them stayed around Liverpool. They told me a few months later when I saw them, they were basically just kind of clerking patients in and, taking notes on ward rounds and taking bloods and not doing a lot. But it was a great job on the island because there was only two doctors in the emergency department. So the house officers would step in when they weren't there, and we'd be the A&E doctor, which is ridiculous when you think about it, because we'd only qualified a few weeks before. But anyway, my colleagues didn't like doing that very much, so I used to do their shifts. I got a bit extra money for doing quite a lot of that sort of work. And also we did some, as part of the medical 6 months, I did some pediatrics for 6 weeks. So it was we did obstetrics and gynecology for 6 weeks. So those were kind of some different things to what my colleagues in Liverpool were doing, and all medical students in general wouldn't get that sort of experience. Anyway, I met Kerry after about 3 months on the Isle of Man. She was Manx, and we got married towards the end of that year on the island. And then I went back to Liverpool. I decided during that year I wanted to be an anaesthetist. I quite liked that as a medical student as well. I used to chat to the anaesthetist, one of the anaesthetists on the Isle of Man, quite a lot while I was doing my surgery attachment. So I managed to get a job back in Liverpool to start training as an anaesthetist, and I went to the Royal in 1983. So that was my first job. If you want to eventually be a hospital consultant, you need to get a postgraduate diploma. So in whatever specialty you want. So if you want to be a consultant surgeon, you need to do the FRCS, the Fellowship of the Royal College of Surgeons. If you want to do anaesthetics, you've got to get that one, obviously. I wanted to try and get the equivalent qualification that the physicians do, and that's the MRCP, Membership of the Royal College of Physicians. And in order to do the final part of that, you had to have done a minimum of a 1-year job in an approved medical post. So after my year at the Royal, I worked at Broad Green Hospital. It's now the Liverpool Heart and Chest Hospital. And I got a really good job for anaesthetist there because it was cardiology, chest medicine, and coronary care. So I did that for a year. And then I went back to anaesthetics as a registrar at Arrow Park on the Wirral. Worked there for 18 months. And during that time, I did quite a lot of intensive care. I learned how to anaesthetize obstetric patients, do epidurals, and also for the first time, anaesthetize children. And then after that, I went to Alderhay Hospital, Children's Hospital, for 6 months as a registrar. And that was a really good job again for anaesthetist because it was considered to be maybe the best training job for an anaesthetist in the UK. I think probably still is. It was a fantastic experience. Probably the busiest job I ever did. But in terms of gaining experience and confidence in anaesthetizing children, it was really good. So I spent 6 months there, then a few more weeks back at the Royal in Liverpool, and then I started in Newcastle as a senior registrar at the end of 1987. I did 2.5 years there, and during that job, I did my first neuro anaesthesia. So that was at the General Hospital in Newcastle, anaesthetising for patients with brain tumours, aneurysms, brain surgery in general. And I did 6 months at the Freeman Hospital and did cardiac anaesthesia and thoracic anaesthesia. And as part of that rotation in Newcastle, I spent 9 months in Sunderland. So I worked in the 4 hospitals there as well. And then after that, I managed to get a consultant job back on the Isle of Man in 1990. And I'd always wanted to go back there because I just loved the island. I'd come back in this summer holidays, usually during the TT fortnight in June, end of May, the first week in June, and I do locums at Nobles Hospital on the Isle of Man, and we'll go back and see Kerry's parents, obviously, and stay there. So I was lucky enough to get that job. We had three little daughters by then, aged 2, 4, and 6. And I knew the schools were good there. It was a safe place for children. I thought they would like it there, and they're still here now. Luckily for me, the 3 daughters are still very close by with their own children now. And I knew Kerry's family was here, so I thought she would be happy back here. So anyway, I came back in 1990, and I spent 30 years working as a consultant at the hospital here at Nobles Hospital. I wanted a general job. It was a perfect job for me because some anaesthetists do mainly, at Alder Hey, they only do children, pediatric anaesthesia. Some anaesthetists do mainly obstetric anaesthesia. Some do mainly intensive care. Some probably do all intensive care medicine. Other anaesthetists do chronic pain, so they have chronic pain clinics, go into theatre and put nerve blocks in and so on, maybe see palliative care patients in the hospice. So on the Isle of Man, I wanted a job where I did a bit of everything. And that's what with being the only hospital on the islands, we had to do literally do a bit of everything. So we anaesthetised children. We did a lot of work in ITU. We did obstetric anaesthesia, of course. I did some work in the hospice. That was very rewarding work, palliative care. Sometimes they'd call us if they were kind of struggling to control pain, usually. And then also on the island, something slightly different about other jobs in anaesthetics maybe. We were also involved in air transfer of critically ill patients, usually across to Liverpool. So we'd have to bring the odd patient with maybe a nasty head injury, maybe a child with severe sepsis, or it was usually head injuries, but I brought a patient across with a nasty chest injury, pelvic injuries. So that there was a bit of everything, literally every day was different. And to me, it was just a perfect job. I loved it. But when it got to 30 years after I started, that was 2020. I thought maybe it's time to pack it all in, including medical school. I'd spent 42 years then in medicine. And although I really loved the job, I thought, I was going to have to stop sometimes. So I'd stopped on the 30th anniversary to the day since I started. And that's it really. That's a bit of summary of my medical background.
Yes, a very, very varied and a lot of experience. I just mentioned that Keith obviously worked in Arrow Park Hospital for a while, which is quite important in the Lucy Letby case. Some of the infants were transferred there and so on. So that's quite interesting. So before we go on to talk about Lucy's case, you actually have quite a rich background in miscarriages of justice. So could you tell us more about that and about some of the court cases that you've attended?
Yeah, I've just, it's kind of, when I look at my grandchildren now, the oldest one's 15, the little one's 5. The thought of them reading the newspaper when they were sort of 8 or 9-year-olds and following true crime, it's hard for me to believe that that's what I did. I just took an interest. I don't even know why really, but I took an interest in true crime. My dad used to get books out of the local library. He was quite interested in true crime, so I used to have a glance at them now and then and read bits of them. But we used to get the Daily Mirror delivered, and I used to follow cases at the time. So in the mid-60s, there were the Moors murders. Most people have heard about them. But I followed them in the press and on the 6 o'clock news. I followed what was going on with there. But there was also lesser known cases like the Cannock Chase murders, also horrific child murders. And I remember following that closely. And then in 1966, I remember just after we won the World Cup, I remember that, but a couple of weeks later, there was an awful triple murder in London. 3 London policemen were murdered in Shepherd's Bush, and they were shot and murdered. One went on the run for a couple of months, and there was a national manhunt looking for him, Harry Roberts. So I remember following all that, and then there was I think the first ever kidnapping for ransom money. Muriel Mackay, that was in towards the end of the 60s. So I've been the Craig twins, of course. So I remember following all those cases. And then in 1973, I think that's when I became interested in miscarriages of justice with Stephen Downing. There was a murder in Bakewell, and I remember I was doing my A-levels then, and he was to spend the next 27 years in prison, totally innocent, but he was convicted of that murder. And then in 1974, there was the start of what are sometimes known as the Irish cases. The Birmingham 6, the Guildford 4 first, then the Birmingham 6 the month after. And then Judith Ward, and the Maguire 7. So all those cases, I followed those cases. The Birmingham 6 one, later on, I went to some of the appeal for that one. So I followed those cases, and when books came out about all those 4 cases, actually, I remember reading those books as soon as they came out. So that was kind of mid-70s when I was doing A-levels. I was following those cases. And then there was quite a few in between, but the next one, I think the big one, was the Carl Bridgewater case. I was just starting my 2nd year at medical school, I remember. And he was a 13-year-old boy delivering newspapers. And he was shot in the head. I think he was sitting on a settee and he'd been shot in the head. And it was thought that he might have disturbed burglars at the farm where he was murdered. And then 4 men were from Birmingham area were arrested. 3 of them were charged with murder, and they were to spend a long time in prison. So I followed that case closely. I mean, while all this was going on, I've been reading true crime books since I was maybe around 10 or 11. And I think probably my 2 favorite books of all time were the Error of Judgment by Chris Mullen, about the Birmingham 6, and Paul Foote, Murder at the Farm, about this Carl Bridgewater case. And then I became interested in Sean Jenkins' case in the 90s. That was 1997, murder of Billy Joe Jenkins. And I corresponded with Bob Woffington, who was probably the most highly respected expert on miscarriages of justice. He was an investigative reporter. And he wrote a book with Sean, which I read, of course. Sean had 2 retrials. I went to both of them, I think, at the Old Bailey. I remember being there for one of them, and there was a live video link to his to New Zealand, I think, where his wife had moved with his children, and she was on speaking live at the trial. So basically, to summarize that, I've always had an interest in miscarriage of justice. I went to the Birmingham 6 final appeal in 91. I've closely followed the one at the end of 88. I was in Newcastle then. I followed that one almost every day in the newspapers. That was, they weren't released then. And then this one was 91, the final appeal. And I went down and I met some of the families of the Birmingham 6. So that was interesting to get into the Old Bailey to hear some of that. Probably moving on from that, most recently, you've mentioned on your channel a few times about the case of Peter Sullivan, which has to be one of the worst, miscarriages of justice ever.
Yeah, it means hard to imagine there can be too many worse given the amount of time he was in prison.
Yeah, I was in Liverpool then, and it was November 80. The murder was 86, the actual murder. Diane Sindall in Birkenhead. I was in Liverpool, not far from Birkenhead. I was in West Kirby living there, and I was working at Arrow Park when it happened. In fact, one of the ODPs I worked with was questioned because he was playing darts with Peter Sullivan that night in the Crown pub in Birkenhead. So he was questioned about what Peter was like, what time did he leave the pub, and so on. But anyway, I think I was busy I was back at the Royal working, and I didn't have time to go to any of the trial, but I followed it all in the Liverpool Echo, and on the news. But I found out that the jury had just retired to consider the verdicts. So I thought about it, and then I thought I'll go over. I got the train over from West Kirby, and I went to the court, and I was going to hang around for a few hours anyway to see if I could get in for the verdict. I'd never been in for a verdict before in a murder trial. So I went over, and I only waited about half an hour. There was people just hanging around outside the court. And then the next thing was a bit of a commotion, everybody rushed into court. And I thought, I can't like stop anyone else getting in I knew it would be busy. So I thought I'll just wait and see if I can get in when everyone else has gone, because I'd missed the whole trial. Anyway, by the time I got to the door, there was I think it was full. The court was full. I couldn't go in. So I waited outside, and it was only like 10 minutes or so. People came rushing out. The reporters came rushing out. And I've heard that he'd been found guilty. And then another man came out, and at the time I wasn't sure who he was, but I think the next day it was in all the photographs of Peter were in the newspapers, and I realised it must have been his brother, and he was going around telling everybody, telling the man next to me that Peter was innocent. I always remember that, and then I just didn't think much more of the case for years, many years, 37 years probably. And then about 9 months ago, I read in the Liverpool Echo, which I read every other night, to keep in touch with the crime news there. I read that there was some query about whether he could be innocent. And then from then on, of course, it came out that they tested, they'd done DNA tests, and it found that semen found on Diane's body wasn't Peter's. And then, but even then, it was another, say, 4 or 5 months, maybe more, before it actually went back to the Court of Appeal. And if anyone's interested, I've seen that it's on YouTube, the actual proceedings in the Royal Court of Justice there in the Strand. And just as a final note on that, I think it just about sums up the whole kind of justice system in a way, because if you watch the judge there, at the end of it all, he summarises the case, and then he says, basically, based on all of this evidence now, Peter Sullivan was to be released, but like no apology as usual. There's never an apology, for 38 years stolen from him. So anyway, that's a little bit about my interest in miscarriage of justice and some of the cases I've been interested in.
Yeah.
I think one more just quick thing about that. I think the justice system as a whole, there's so many issues with it, I think. And I think if anyone again is interested, I think 2 brilliant speeches were from Jerry Conlon when he was released outside the Old Bailey after his successful appeal. I think that was 1989. I remember watching that. And then the Birmingham Six were all outside the Old Bailey, of course. And Paddy Hill, one of the 6, he made a similar speech to Jerry. And they're excellent speeches, because they just sum up what they thought about the justice system. And I think now, I'm not sure if I think it may be worse now than then, not better. So, in terms of miscarriage of justice, there are still, most people know about Andrew Wilkinson, but there's been so many that aren't reported, So, that's just a little bit about my interest anyway in that issue.
Well, I think it's really interesting because I think you're quite unique in having such an interest in miscarriage of justice, but then also having the medical background as well. You're also a published author, so could you tell us a little bit more about that?
I've only written 2 books. One was a book called Manx Murders, and that's about murders on the Isle of Man for over 150-year period up to the year 2000. And that came out in 2003. I spent about a year writing that and researching a lot of the old cases in the Manx Museum archives. And I think I don't know why I thought about writing a book at that time, but I've read so many books on true crime over the years, and I just thought it'd be interesting to try and write one.
Mm.
I rang the coroner, the High Bailiff on the island, and the coroner. You have that dual role, and I had a kind of nice relationship with him because I sometimes have to talk to him about cases, often in ITU, and discuss cases with him of maybe deaths when we didn't have a definite diagnosis, and we talked. I'd report them to him, and he'd sometimes say, I'll have a think, and we might have to have an inquest, or we might have to have a post-mortem, and so on. Anyway, I spoke to him to ask him what he thought about the idea, and he said, you're wasting your time. There hasn't been enough cases. And I said, well, I've already got I think I had about 9 or 10, and there was a few more that I knew about. So anyway, I pressed on and carried on with that. And then I asked him if he would write the foreword and discuss a bit about the differences with Manx law and English law. And he did a nice foreword eventually. So that was that book. And the other book was towards the end of my career. I thought it would be nice to give me something to do, to kind of adapt to not working full time as I had been for 38 years or so. It'd be nice to put a few thoughts down with a view to writing a book about my career.
Mm.
So I started doing that just before I retired. And then maybe for about 9 months after I retired, I've carried on. And that book's called If in Doubt, an anaesthetist story. And it's just an account of my training, actually from A levels through medical school, anaesthetic training, the medical job that I did, a little bit about the exams that I've sat. And then I've got chapters on like mistakes. I wrote about how we try to avoid them and some of the mistakes I've made and how you learn from them and so on. And the final chapter was called Change. I've got a title for each chapter. The final one is just called Changes, and it's like a kind of summary of the main changes I've seen during my career of 37 years as an anaesthetist. So that was that book. So they're the only 2 books that I've had published.
That's very good. So with all of that experience in mind that you've discussed so far, I know that you believe Lucy's case to be unique in terms of miscarriages of justice. So can you explain why?
Yeah, I mean, I think with the other cases, I didn't really follow the trial of Lucy, the case of Lucy, that closely, to be honest. I heard it on the. I was in theatre one day, and I heard on the news that the radio was on in theatre, and I heard there was something going on in Chester. So I'm guessing that must have been about 2017. I'm not sure when it was first, roughly that sort of time. And then over the next year or two, not much seemed to happen, but I knew there was something going on there. And then when the trial happened, I emailed the court. And I said, if I come over, can I get it? Will I get in? Is there any chance of all of getting into the court? I'm coming from the Isle of Man. And they replied straight away and said, you can't get in. There's too many, it's a small courtroom, I think. And there's so many people who've got seats reserved there. But there's not an overflow room. There's another courtroom where they've got like a live feed into the court. So you can watch it in that room with the reporters and anyone else who wants to. So you said you might have to queue up a bit, but you'll probably get in there. Anyway, I thought about it, and in the end, I didn't go over. And I followed it in the newspapers, but I didn't really take that much. It went on for 10 months or so I didn't really follow it that closely. But towards the end, every day I was checking to see if there was any verdicts. I was waiting for the news to come out about the verdicts, and that went on for many days, over 20 days, I think. But so I didn't really follow that closely at the time, but maybe 2 years ago, I became more interested in it. And in that time, probably like yourself, I've spent a lot of time, now I've retired, and I've got a lot of time to kind of research it and look into it. And as I went on looking into it more and more, it just became apparent to me that almost every week I'd discover something else that made me think this was almost certainly a miscarriage of justice. In the other cases that I looked into or I was interested in, I could see why they might have been charged and even how they might have been found guilty. There is, the Birmingham Six, for example, there were 6 Irishmen leaving Birmingham They'd been in the bar in New Street Station having a drink. 5 of them went off to on the train to Haitian, and they were heading back to Ireland to Northern Ireland for an IRA funeral. So a man that they knew, they'd grown up, I think, with him, and they all knew him. And as a matter of just as none of them were in the IRA, but they thought, they would go back and kind of pay the respects to him and his family, and then they would also catch up with their own friends and family back there. So they left Birmingham on the train just shortly before the bombs went off. The two bombs went off in the 2 pubs in Birmingham. So at the time, I was doing A-levels at the time, and I heard about this, and we were all, it seemed to most people, I think, that they'd got the men who did it really quickly. And of course, it all came out later that they'd been beaten up by the police, and photographs appeared with them. Each one of them had injuries to the face. One of them had Richard McElkenny. His were really bad, I remember thinking. But anyway, it turned out that 4 of them had made confessions, but I don't think the confessions really matched up. And looking back now, it's so obvious. IRA men, 6 IRA men, all chatting away in the bar at New Street Station, Irish accents, leaving Liverpool just as the bombs are about to go off, on their way to an IRA funeral. I mean, it's just, and then it turned out later that one of them, at least, he said that his daughter was out drinking, used to drink in one of the pubs that were bombed, and for all he knew, she could have been in there. So it's just, but at the time, we didn't think about all this. So what I'm saying, what I'm getting at is, in that case in particular, you can see how they might have been suspects, and then 4 made confessions. Paddy Hill and Jerry Hunter, they never confessed to anything, but the other 4 did. They said they were all involved. So, and then in Sean Jenkins' case, for example, that was another case. I didn't mention that, but I think I mentioned it, but I had a big interest in that. He was found to have some blood spatter on his, microscopic dots of blood on his clothing. So you can see how he might have been, the police might have kind of zoomed in on him and thought he was a good suspect. So I can see in a lot of cases how they were charged, and how they went to trial. But in Lucy's case, the more I look into it, I can't see any. I haven't been able to find any evidence of any crime, really. And it's just hard for me to get my head around how she actually was charged in the first place, how she was even suspected, and how it went to trial, and then how she was found guilty, and how her appeals turned down, and got what I think, could be wrong, but I think there's probably the harshest sentences that anyone's ever had since the death penalty was abolished, and that was 60 years ago. So that's why I think her case is unique in a way, because there's so many things which I'm sure you're going to talk about, but there's so many aspects of the case which make it, to me, seem such. I can't imagine an any more obvious and clear miscarriage of justice. That's the way I feel about it. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's the kind of the way I feel about it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, fundamentally, this case shouldn't have gone to court. There's no basis for it to go to court, is there?
I don't think so. I'm shocked that it went to court in the first place. There's so many things about it that are off, and I've heard things. Well, I'm hearing about a lot more things now. Not that I needed any more convincing, but some of the people you've interviewed, like Steve Watts, for example, recently, some of the things he said were like absolutely shocking. Jane Hutton, things she said about CPS. So there's so many things are coming out all the time. It's almost, to me, like it's all, what's the word? It's like all building up to I don't know where it's going to end, but it's all looking more and more obvious that this is a terrible miscarriage of justice. That's what I feel.
Yeah, and there's so many things. I can assure you it's a real challenge to fit those all into a book.
Yeah, well, we met in, I saw you in Hereford, but we met in Manchester, obviously, had a chat. Um, and I remember saying to you there, you told me about your book, and I said, oh, maybe I didn't say this in Manchester, but I've said to you, you could probably write a book with 2,000 pages, and no one's going to read it, but it must be difficult to know. There must be a lot of stuff that it's not in the book that you would like to have in, but it's going to be too long. So it's a massive case, this, partly because of all the convictions that all the charges that were made. There wasn't just one or two, attempted murder and a murder. There was so many. But yeah, it's a massive case with so many aspects to it. It must be hard to know what to include and what not to.
Yeah, I mean, I've crammed in as much as I possibly can.
Yeah,
Um, I'm an experienced writer and author,
yeah,
so I know how to do it and I know what to do, but undoubtedly there's stuff that you leave out that could go in quite easily.
yeah,
I think one of the things is there's long periods in the court case or long periods of cross-examination that
yeah,
I've exposed, obviously, on the channel. You
yeah.
can't put stuff like that in because it
No,
just goes on forever.
yeah,
So you have to try and proceed that in a few words, which
yeah,
you can do. But
yeah,
I mean, the whole thing recently about Dr. Evans making this claim about, oh, I noticed that the police and the Crown Prosecution Service had mixed the data. Completely untrue. Because
What was that bit? Sorry, what was that bit? Sorry, please.
Dr. Evans said he wrote this letter to
Oh,
newspaper
yeah, yeah.
editors,
Sorry.
and in
Yeah,
this letter he said,
yeah,
"Oh, I noticed in court that the CPS and the police and the Crown prosecution, the
yeah,
prosecution had mixed the dates up in court." It's completely untrue. He
yeah,
never said anything like that.
yeah.
He was in witness box for 4 hours.
Mm.
So, and then on top of that, you can't just start making stuff up in court. You can't just say, "Oh, I've noticed the case is wrong, so I'll change the case around in court."
Yeah,
There's all kinds of issues to do with disclosure, and there's legislation. He knows that statement is untrue. He must know that it's untrue.
yes.
So I mean that's fairly extraordinary itself. I couldn't devote to. I've mentioned that in the book, but I couldn't devote an enormous amount of space to it
Okay.
because it takes too long. It takes too long to show that he was asked about this like 25 times in court
Yeah.
and never once said anything like what he's claimed in this letter.
But it's so important that it needs to be mentioned in the book, at
It
least.
is in there. It's
Yeah,
in there. Yeah,
yeah,
but you can't. You have to try and compact it into
exactly.
a digestible
Yeah,
form. But yeah, it's a. I mean, I obviously share your view. I think the extraordinary thing about this case is there were so many chances to stop it, and
yeah.
everyone failed all the way down the line. Um,
Yeah, I thought the same. I mean, not at the time, but now looking back, why didn't someone say, hang on a minute, maybe are we on the right track here, or have we got it all completely wrong? Um, just everything about it, the way the doctors came in and started. I'm sure that at first they genuinely believed something was going on, but
mm,
eventually, when they did go to the police, it was like almost like the police were not treating them in awe, but they was just assuming that everything they said
yeah,
has to be
well,
the truth because they're doctors. Doctors don't.
no, I
Never
think
mind. And
I don't think you're far wrong with saying they treated them with awe, though.
sorry.
I don't think it's entirely inaccurate to say that they treated them with awe, that they were
Well,
ignoring them.
I'm not saying that's what happened, but it just almost comes across like these are doctors, and these are not just doctors, they're experienced consultants, and you can tell that they're genuinely concerned about, the care of their babies, and they are genuinely worried. So, but then to just not to just assume that it's as they say it is, this is a nurse.
Mm.
And then from then on, it just looked to me like although they said the opposite, I think they would kind of hinted the opposite happened. I think they just, from that moment on, they almost just looked for evidence that Lucy Letby was behind it all. That's how it came across to me. But that's just looking back over the last 2 years, as I say, at the time. But we couldn't have known all this at the time anyway. It's just now that more and more is coming out. And the
Yeah,
things I'm saying, you know, I think about things like the stability of the children. The impression was that all these babies were very stable, and suddenly they just died. And but with that, and that's using that as an example. I haven't had access to the trial transcripts or any of the case notes like the Shoeley's experts had. So it's hard for me to comment on some things like that because I wasn't. Do you know what I mean? I can't really.
Yes.
It's just things that I've seen, bits and pieces that I've read, bits and pieces that I've seen online. The Thirlwall Inquiry, I went to a bit of that, and that's a lot of that's available, which is really good to have. But to actually not have the actual notes, because that's all Dr. Evans and Dr. Bowen, they didn't have anything but the notes. They couldn't go and question people and ask them what was really going on there because it was so long before they got involved. So I think because a lot of people like me haven't got access to those notes and records and obs charts from the nurses, it's hard to be, what's the word? We can't say with certainty, that what the actual what was actually going on. That's
Yeah.
what I feel.
Yeah.
Um,
That's fair.
yeah.
So with that in mind, what are the biggest red flags for you with Lucy's case?
Well, I think there was so many. There's quite a lot, obviously, and it's hard to know which one's more important than another one. But
Yeah.
I think one big red flag for me would be the fact that no one saw her do anything at all suspicious. And I hadn't been to. I actually went to Chester to when I was a medical student just for a week, but I haven't worked in that unit. But from what I've seen of the plans of the layout of the unit, and from what people have said, it wasn't a big unit, spread over a wide area. So I think the nurses were working in close proximity to one another. And to think that this was supposed to have gone on over like a 12 or 13-month period with all these collapses and you know, uh, suspected murders, for, and all the different ways of that these were supposed to have been carried out, with air embolism, insulin poisoning, all these, excess air and milk down the nasogastric tubes, all these hypotheses as to how this could have happened. It's hard to believe that no one saw, not just no one saw her do anything suspicious. They never saw act in any way suspiciously, and before these collapses or after them. She was upset like all the nurses would be, but there was nothing to say that, she was behaved any differently to what you would or what I would expect her to how to behave. Another thing about it was another red flag for me. Some people might disagree. I think her behaviour from the very start has been that of the way I would expect an innocent person to behave. And I don't know why I keep doing it, but I keep imagining if it was one of my three daughters who was similar age, they're all slightly older than Lucy, but if this happened to them, how would they behave? And everything she's done to me is the way they would have probably behaved. They would be polite and they would answer the questions. They'd be devastated, as Lucy was, obviously, when she got moved off the unit and she knew they were investigating. And especially when she got arrested, they'd be absolutely, totally devastated. But I just think the way she's behaved, even in meetings, I've seen some transcripts of meetings between her and her parents, senior nurses and senior managers, or one meeting at least. And I've heard from some of the senior nurses who met her, one in particular who met her after she was moved off the unit. And they described how she was absolutely, crying continuously and just, she said that the meetings were harrowing. She'd meet up with her every week or two when she was moved off the unit. So, and she wasn't really allowed or told not to contact her friends who she'd been working with for the last 3 years on the unit. So that's a big red flag anyway, the way she behaved. Another one was the fact that she had worked there, I think, for 3 years, just over 3 years on the unit. And in that time, as far as I can see, there was no concerns about anything. In fact, she'd been described by one senior nurse as the creme de la creme of the neonatal nurses. She had an extra qualification, so she could look after the sickest babies. So, like she was doing well, well respected, hard working, picking up extra shifts here and there when the unit wasn't covered. And I think to go from that and then suddenly to start harming babies in so many different ways, with apparently no change in her behaviour. It just doesn't seem, and there's nothing in her background that, as far as I can see, that would suggest she had some kind of, psychological issues. There's nothing to suggest that she was suddenly going to become one of the worst serial killers ever, So, as I said at this, at the start of this, there's nothing. It just doesn't make any sense to me. It's all kind of off. There's something not right about everything about the case. It seems a bit off to me. So that's another one. Other red flags, I think the grievance procedure is a big thing because the jury didn't hear about this, of course. The judge decided they weren't allowed to hear, but the grievance procedure to me is probably an unprecedented. There's a few unprecedented things about this case, I think, but that's one of them. In my 38 years as a doctor, but 37 years as an anaesthetist, working in various hospitals, but for 30 years at Nobles Hospital on the Isle of Man here, I've never heard of a nurse taking a grievance out against any doctor or any person, to be honest. They're not that very common. So to have a nurse take a grievance out against 7 consultants, paediatricians, I think that might be unprecedented. It might never have happened before. In fact, I'm pretty certain it's never happened before. But then to actually have all the everything up, the grievance upheld. So every part of the grievance was upheld. And then for the Dr. Green, who was in charge of the pharmacy at the Countess of Chester, for him to say that, he was not happy with the way the consultants had behaved. And I think I'm correct in saying that he suggested that they should be made to apologise. Well, I am right to say that. I'm assuming he told the chief executive that's what he thought should happen. And there was mention of the General Medical Council and possible disciplinary procedures if they didn't apologise. So that's all. That seems to me to be unprecedented as well, But of course, that didn't come out. The jury didn't hear all this. So, and then there was the reports like the college report and other kind of independent reports saying there was no evidence of suspicion. The pathologists, I think 6 of the babies who died had postmortems. And as far as I'm aware, there was nothing suspicious hinted at by them. And when you report, like I reported quite a few deaths over my career to the coroner. And sometimes the pathologist would ring me up and he'd ask me questions about, because if I'd been involved a lot with the case, sometimes they'd ring me up, or the coroner might ring back and ask and question me. As far as I know, there was no hint to the coroner or the pathologist or the coroner's officer. They would kind of liaise between me and the coroner, not just me, my colleagues and the coroner. There was no suspicions from anyone that there was anything going on really at first. So, and I do remember at the Thirlwall inquiry, the senior coroner, I think, for Cheshire, I think he said he was horrified when he heard that this was going on. There was these suspicions because he hadn't known about it. And I think that was the word he used. He was horrified to not have been told about this. So that's another red flag, I think, the way that there weren't any apparently suspicions from anyone. But in the background, this was kind of rumbling on, these accusations against Lucy seem to have been going on, but people who should have probably known weren't aware of it till much later. So that's another red flag. So I'm sure there's a lot more. I mean, another red flag is the fact that on the unit there was definitely just 2 ward rounds a week when there should have been probably 2 a day. So that's a red flag that something might not be quite, maybe the care wasn't as good as it should have been, because how can you have proper continuity of care and plans made for the next 12 hours when you're having 2 ward rounds a week, And I know the college.
Can I ask you a question on that?
Yeah.
So, I mean, I just read the other day in the RCPCH report from 2016, other departments at that hospital were doing an appropriate number of ward rounds.
Okay.
But how is it possible that the unit that arguably requires the most monitoring of anyone in the entire hospital is not doing an appropriate number of ward rounds?
Well, just to kind of go off a tangent slightly, when I was a house officer on the Isle of Man here in 1982, we got our first ever paediatrician. So before then we didn't even have a paediatrician on the whole of the Isle of Man, and that was Dr. Birkin, and I worked for him, when he was a house officer. I did 6 weeks of paediatrics as part of my house job. So in those days he was looking after the children's ward on his own, and then he'd be in sometimes all night when he'd get a neonate would come in, and he'd intubate the neonate and put them on a ventilator, and he'd had a little room in ITU where they were looked after. So he would put the lines in himself, and he'd sometimes ask us to come and, later on when I was a consultant, to come and intubate the babies or help him with various things. But basically, he was the first paediatrician on the island. So the paediatricians at the Counties of Chester, my understanding is, they were all paediatricians with a kind of interest in neonatology. So they covered both. They covered the paediatric ward. They would do the paediatric clinics, so they'd see all the children in the clinics. They'd be on call for, I'm assuming they would be on call as well for just general paediatrics, but also for the neonatal unit. And I know the college report, that was one of the criticisms that they made about the fact that there wasn't, the consultants weren't around enough on the unit. And I think they said something about there was leadership from a distant, they actually weren't on the, like in a neonatology unit run by all neonatologists, they'd be around all the time, day and night. They'd be living in. I'm assuming they'd be living in there at night. Whereas these paediatricians had a lot of other work to do. I'm sure they did. They had a lot of work to do apart from the neonatology unit. So I can't really answer your question, but with all the other work that they had. The fact that there was a few of them, you would think they would still be able to organise a regular 2 ward rounds a day. So I can't say much more. But the fact, I was absolutely couldn't believe it when I heard they had 2 ward rounds a week, and how that went on, and whether I don't want to criticise management, because I think management did as much as they could, but whether they knew about that, I don't know. But if they had, you think they might have said, "Hang on, this can't be right," And so, but the paediatricians themselves, you think they would think, "Hang on, this is just not good enough." They must have known that this was not acceptable.
I can't understand how they couldn't recognise that and how they thought it was acceptable.
Yeah, well, I can't.
I mean, now that I've spoken to many people, neonatal nurses, people who work on neonatal units, paediatricians, etc., everyone else that I've spoken to, literally every single person, is apoplectic about the fact that this went on. So how I just can't understand it.
Yeah, I can't understand it either. It's not acceptable, as you say, and you would think one of them or all of them really should have known that and done something about it, and gone to management and said, look, if you genuinely, you might have to cancel a clinic, or change the working pattern completely to make sure they had the 2 ward rounds a day.
Especially as well when okay, we all make mistakes. This is a bad mistake, clearly, but especially when things were starting to go wrong.
Yeah,
you would think, okay, we need to review all of our practices.
Exactly. I mean, when things are going wrong, on the one hand, they're saying that they're pretty sure that this nurse is causing harm to babies, and you're right, there's still the 2 ward rounds carried on till long after that. The college, they came in the college visit. I think Ian Harvey, the medical director, kind of asked them to come and look at the unit. They came in September, I think, of 2016, by which time she'd just been moved off the unit. And they mentioned in the report about the 2 ward rounds. So that was still going on then. So it's even worse when you think about it. They must have, while all these accusations have been made, as if they're all squeaky clean, it turns out that 2 ward rounds have just carried on all the way through this, and were still going on when the college came. So yeah, it's hard to believe that they felt that was acceptable.
Yeah, absolutely. So you've witnessed many court cases over the years, I know. How do you feel about the conduct of the prosecution in court in the Lucy Letby case?
Well, I think the way that I mean, I haven't read the transcript, I don't know whether you've read the whole transcript, so I haven't got that. But from what I've read about and read at the Thirlwall inquiry and seen on various, there's been three documentaries on fairly recently about the case on the three channels. It seems that the way that we know that Lucy's had a defence expert who wasn't actually called. So that Mike Hall, he wasn't actually called, so the jury never heard from him. But on the other side, the main two witnesses, the experts, sorry, were Sandy Bowen and Dr. Evans. And I think most of this case comes down to Dr. Evans' theories or hypotheses on how these supposed attacks on these babies happened. So Nicholas Johnson, when he was questioning Lucy, for example, she was in the witness box for quite a long time. And some of the questions he was asking her about the shredder, did she have a shredder? And this went on for quite a long time, I think. And then there was this thing about going commando, which I must say I've never heard of it in my life. I don't know what that was all about. I still haven't actually looked up. I think I know what it means, but he was kind of making out that she must have known. I think it was in a text message. And he was asking her, and it seems to, and then he was asked at one point, I'm sure I read somewhere that he said about did she remember, she said she couldn't remember something. And he said, do you remember being born? And she said, I don't know what she said. I'm assuming she said, nobody remembers being born, And he said, yeah, but you were born. So, and he was kind of implying that she, might be lying about things. And to me, it was just a desperate attempt to make her look as bad as possible and to give the impression, to kind of demonstrate that she's a liar. She wasn't always truthful about everything. So that was something that I didn't really like. And other people have commented that some of the tactics he used were almost like bullying, bullying tactics. One thing about it was I heard your interview with Anna Doherty from the Spoken Injustice, and she said, and she's a lawyer, and she felt that some of the things that happened were kind of not out of the ordinary. This is kind of accepted behaviour for a prosecuting barrister. So I was kind of surprised at that. I'm sure she's probably right, but I'm sure she is right. But I was kind of shocked at that, really. That she wasn't saying she thought it was acceptable. She just thought this is how it goes sometimes. This is the way they behave. So I wasn't with the Judge Goss as well. Some of the things that he said, it appeared to me anyway to be biased against Lucy. There seemed to be some bias against the defence, and some of the rulings that were made, he overruled things that I thought should have been allowed. He didn't allow in the fact that there'd been the grievance or the college report, which I felt were important. Maybe I'm not a lawyer, obviously, but it seemed like the jury should have known about these things.
Absolutely.
I've commented a few times that I think Lucy didn't really stand a chance from the start. There were so many things stacked against her. So that's about as much as I can say about it. It just didn't seem like she had a fair trial for many, many reasons, one of them being the way the prosecution handled the case.
Yes, I agree. I wasn't that surprised by what Anna said, because the thing is that I noticed is that all these things that you've mentioned occur, but no one seems bothered. The defense don't seem bothered about it. The judge doesn't seem bothered about it. It's not. So I just assume, well, this must happen all the time. So, and I think it probably does, which is, that.
A lot of people have. Sorry to interrupt, Chris. A lot of people have criticised Ben Myers, for not calling Mike Hall, and for not kind of picking up on certain things but I don't know. I still don't know why I don't think anyone knows exactly why Mike Hall wasn't called. Phil Hammond in Private Eye wrote, he gave a reason why he thought that might have happened, but none of us really know. But certainly in the retrial, I've seen his, there's a YouTube video about kind of a reconstruction of his closing argument. And I thought it was excellent, really. That, not that I know much about I don't know anything about being a barrister, but I thought his closing was really good in the way that he kind of told the jury about his concerns about Dr. Jayaram's evidence.
Mm.
I mean, he said all the things that I was thinking about, and he made his point that there was no real evidence apart from Dr. Jayaram's evidence, and he made it in a way that I thought was very powerful. And I think even Judge Goss might have said that he had some slight reservations or skepticism about the evidence because he hadn't told anyone for so long. So I'm pretty sure he said that to the jury, which was good, but at the end of the day, it didn't make any difference. They still found her guilty of that, and she got a 15th whole life sentence. That trial was another point. That trial to me was as if the first trial wasn't bad enough. The retrial was worse in one way, that I don't even know why they did retry that particular case for attempted murder. But the jury all knew. They were they were constantly reminded, I think, by Nicholas Johnson, that Lucy had already had all these life sentences, not just life sentences, whole life sentences. And I've spoken to a couple of nurses who went to the retrial, and they've told me that it was almost, not constantly, but he would remind it every now and then. He'd say, right, you murdered baby A, except he wouldn't say baby A, he'd use the actual name. And then you murdered baby B. He'd constantly remind them of this, that she was a convicted murderer, which she was. We know that. And Judge Goss did say that, you must put all that out of your mind, and you've got to just base your deliberations on what you hear in this case. But how could they? They knew she'd been convicted of all these awful crimes with this 14 whole life sentences already. How can you put that out of your mind, and not? It must creep in, that she's already done all these awful things, So that was another, another thing that wasn't. He constantly, as if they needed reminding of this, he would constantly tell them that this had happened before, which didn't seem very fair to me.
Yeah, I mean, I think we both agree that it was an extremely unfair court case. I didn't even follow it at the time.
Yeah.
Even though I was very interested in Lucy's case by then, because I knew she would lose. I knew she didn't have a chance because of the media coverage. How could she have a fair trial? And that's a serious question for a retrial. Although, of course, the climate has changed so much, it may be that generally the public opinion is in her favour by the time of that occurring. But at the time of Child K, that wasn't the case. The New Yorker article had been banned in this country. We hadn't had the Guardian article. We hadn't had the Daily Telegraph article.
Yeah.
And it's the thing that speaks volumes is the jury took a couple of hours, I think, to make the decision. Then they just said, "Oh, you're guilty."
In a retrial.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a very short period of time. So we both definitely agree on that.
Yeah.
So I want to ask you about the statistical aspects of this case and the withdrawal of Professor Jane Hutton from the police investigation. I know you have a view on that.
Yeah, I didn't know about that at all till your interview with her. I hadn't realised that. I knew there was some involvement, but as far as the statistics go, I have to be honest and say that I've got not much knowledge of statistics at all. And when I think at A-level maths, we did a little bit of statistics, and then as part of the first part of my anaesthetic postgraduate exam, there was some statistics, and I used to keep my fingers crossed when I was getting a Vivas, getting a question about in a Viva with two examiners. I used to dread being asked about statistics because I didn't know anything about it really. So I can't say much about statistics, but what I can say is it's clear from people like Jane Hutton and Richard Gill, Professor Richard Gill, and others who've come forward that they have very serious concerns about the fact that the statistician wasn't involved in the case, really. I never quite understood why, but then Jane Hutton explained to you that she was being lined up to assist the police. I think the police had contacted her, and she was being lined up to help them, and give them advice on how to, how she felt they should run the inquiry. And then I think she said that she'd actually got to the stage of agreeing a fee, so what she was going to be paid to do this. And I think she was just waiting for the next stage. And then it came out that it came out in Steve Watt's interview, I think it was, where he said that the National Crime Agency had advised Cheshire Police that they should convene a panel involving a statistician and an obstetrician, and I think an experienced nurse, definitely, who done a lot of, someone like Michelle Warden, that sort of person who was a real expert in neonatal medicine. Anyway, so the next thing I've heard was that the CPS had, from Jane, the CPS, the police contacted her to say that she wasn't required now, they didn't really need it. And the CPS had told them that's what they recommended. And then she said this might be actually a crime, a criminal act for the CPS to. So when I heard that, I thought, God, this is it's unbelievable. The CPS themselves are being accused of possibly committing a crime. So, I thought I'd heard it all. And when I heard that, and then I heard Steve Watt's description, and the advice that Steve gave about about this panel, to me sounded like fantastic advice, from the National Crime Agency. This is what we think you need. And I don't know how we got access to all this, but he's seen the letters, the correspondence. And then when he described the correspondence between Dr. Evans and the police, saying that basically, I think as he said, I've got this covered, we don't need all these people. And then for the police to go along with that, having been told from the National Crime Agency, this is what we need, which is what I bet if you asked all of Shuley's panel of experts, all 28 or 9 of them, however many he's got now, I bet all of them would say, if you asked them, who do you think should have been on a panel involved with this, helping the police? I bet you they all would have said exactly the same as the National, they would have said, you need an obstetrician, definitely. Martin Pittman described the importance of that.
Yeah.
So that they would have all agreed with that, but Dr. Evans was the opposite. So we don't need all these people, and for the police to then just accept that and go along with it, it's another shocking thing about the case, I think. I mean, you couldn't make this stuff up, I don't think. If you've written a book about the case, if you wrote a fictional book, a fictional story about a nurse, well respected, by everyone, even the nice Lucy, Steve Breer used to call it, nice Lucy. She was a lovely, person. Dawn Howe, I saw Dawn Howe speak in Manchester. Well, you used her to speak in Manchester. And some of the things she said, I've just scribbled a couple down here, but this is her best friend, known her from school. And she said that she knew Lucy the way we know our best friends. We know what they're capable of. And it's kind of it's obvious, really. But, if you imagine your best friend and you've known him from school, and then he's accused of something like this, you would know it's absolutely ridiculous, And if he said to you, I didn't do it, you would obviously believe him. And that's the position Dawn was in. But she said things like, she was talking about the media. You mentioned the media briefly before. She said that through the media, the perfectly innocent actions were warped and framed to cast them in a sinister light. And that's exactly what happened with the media. They tried to fabricate the most abhorrent image of a monster they could conjure. And then there was this relentless outpouring of hate and anger to anyone that spoke out. And I do remember, I think I read in a Welsh, I forget what it was now, but it was a Welsh kind of media thing online where they'd spoken to Dawn, and she'd said that basically anyone that that wanted to speak out in defence of it, nurses, were kind of warned off by hospital management. I mean, or senior nurses. I'm assuming it's hospital management, and they were saying it could affect their careers. So they were kind of told, don't say anything, which is also not good. But and then the grievance, with the grievance we discussed earlier, Dawn mentioned that and said that she could kind of imagine how that grievance could have led to like what you call a petty vendetta, so the consultant, they wouldn't have been happy about it, definitely. And the final thing she said, which to me is kind of really important, she said that Lucy Letby, to her, is the most caring, kind, caring person she's known, gentle person. So that's kind of, I'm not sure why I went off at that tangent, what we're talking about, but that's to me, is powerful. It's very powerful, isn't it? From a best friend. So we're talking about statistics, I think, weren't we?
Yeah, Professor.
So I've lost my thread slightly here, but I think, as I say, the way that all this came about with Jane Hutton being taken off the inquiry, and the way Dr. Evans said he would kind of stand in for these people that they didn't need, then that's plainly wrong, and the police shouldn't have gone along with that.
I think that you don't really need any medical qualifications to know that you need a multidisciplinary panel. Plus, they were actually explicitly advised they should do that.
It was great. It was great advice, wasn't it? I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
And as Steve Watts said, they didn't just suggest that once and say, maybe you should consider this. He said they weren't demanding that they did it, but they must have said it once or twice after that, I think, as well. They just reminded them that's what they think they needed to do. And they seem to have done the exact opposite. They haven't got an obstetrician or an experienced nurse. Or another thing they suggested was, which is, it's so obvious, it really should go without saying, they should have a neonatologist. Well, they didn't have a neonatologist. They had pediatricians who admittedly had an interest. And it's like saying, I was kind of involved in all kinds of things, as I said, but it's like saying we've got an anaesthetic case here with, we'll say, a patient's died having a cesarean section. It's like me going along and saying, can I be, or they might, if I was an expert, and they might, I don't suppose it would come to ask me, if I put myself forward and said, can I get involved with this case? They'd say, well, hang on, you're a general anaesthetist, you do a bit of everything. We all know that. You're not an expert in obstetrics. And I'd say, well, that's true. I'm not an expert in anything, but I'm certainly, you would need an obstetric anaesthetist who does that as a full-time. Or if you've got say there was a child, there's an anaesthetic death involving a 10-year-old. Well, you need a pediatric anaesthetist who does that every day. That's his job, looking after just children. Not like me, doing a bit of everything, going in the hospice now and then and anaesthetizing 90-year-olds, people having cataract operations. Do you know what I'm saying? It's not, you need someone who's a real expert at working at the time, preferably, very experienced. You need those people, so that's what a little bit about my opinion on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree entirely. So you already talked a little bit about Dr. Evans and him advising the panel to just rely on his opinion. But can we talk about the selection of Dr. Evans and more broadly the selection of expert witnesses for court cases?
I think at the Manchester meeting, Roger Norwich, who's a retired medical legal expert himself, he said he gave a talk there. I'm sure you've heard it, and he started off by saying, and I suspected this anyway. I mean, experts aren't like some kind of almost godlike figures. They're more knowledgeable and better than the rest of us. They're not that's not the way it is. Roger said in his talk, at the start of his talk, an expert, medical expert, is someone who says they are. That's it. You know, they say I'm an expert, and then they manage to convince people or get people to employ them to act as experts. Now, you don't. So maybe that's a bit simplifying the picture, but the way that my understanding is the NCA, National Crime Agency, have an office. I think that was talked about in one meeting. They've got a department which has a kind of a register or a list of known medical experts, and they can recommend to the police which experts they might want to call, or the courts. In this case, if my understanding is correct, Dr. Evans heard about the case. I think it was in the Guardian. He said he read an article. I think it was a Guardian, but anyway, he read in a newspaper there was something going on in Chester, and there were suspicions about there's some suspicious deaths. And I think he, if I've got it right, I think he contacted the National Crime Agency himself and said that something to the effect of this sounded like his sort of case. You know, he's interested in finding out more about it. And then I think the police. I can't remember whether he rang the police. I think the police rang Dr. Evans, and then he went to talk to them. And then the next thing I read, if it's true, it's very it's surprising to say the least. He was shown the set of case notes. I think it was Baby O. And again, if I've got this wrong, apologies, but I think he saw a photograph of the liver. Injury to the liver of Baby O. And then he said he knew within 10 minutes or so that there was basically something suspicious about it. That's my understanding of how he became involved.
I think just to clarify, he didn't even put it as neutrally as you did. He said immediately, this infant has been subjected to inflicted harm.
Yeah. He said there was, I don't know, he said foul play or whether there's some deliberate harm, whatever it was. But so I think, and he knew in 10 minutes what other people had never really known before. So there would have been if there's a photograph of a liver, there must have been a post-mortem. So the pathologist, it was a post-mortem, so the pathologist was involved. He'd never raised any concerns as far as I know. The doctors who referred the case to the coroner, I'm assuming they never mentioned anything about any concerns. The coroner himself. So the way that he came into the whole case is very unusual, and doesn't seem right to me for that to be able to happen. You know, how you can just kind of offer your services. I thought the idea was that you were contacted, and then you might not want to do the case. You might feel it's not for you, or you're not quite experienced enough to act as an expert in that. But to actually put yourself forward in the way he did just doesn't seem right to me. So that's the main. And then another thing about expert witnesses. Again, I could be wrong here, and if I am, apologies. But Dr. Bowen was called in later on. Now, to me, she should have been. Well, it's obvious she should have been totally unbiased, independent, and I'm assuming they would have given her the case notes at some point as well. And then she should have made her own mind up and not known what Dr. Evans, what he thought about it. Now, if she'd done that, which is what she should have done, I can't believe I can't accept for a minute that it's impossible for her to have come up with the same hypotheses as to how these collapses and deaths happened as Dr. Evans. It's just absolutely, it's not possible for her to have come up with those same theories, or her or anyone else, you know. So, but what I've heard recently is, and it might not be true, that she didn't get the notes independently first. She was given Dr. Evans' opinions of what he thought, Now, if that's true, that's definitely not right, because
It's
she's
a fact. It's a fact that she was given his reports.
okay. Well, if that's
That's a
true,
fact.
that is absolutely terrible, because she's biased straight away. Then she knows, he's thinking this is what's happened, and she hasn't had to work it out herself. She hasn't had to look through the notes and look at the stability of the children and look at the nursing notes and the medical notes and the blood results and the X-ray. She hasn't had to do any of that. If she believes him, which is what I think she did believe him, because she went along with his hypotheses. If she was told all that before she'd actually seen all the notes and studied them and gone through all that stuff I've just mentioned and come up with her own theories. Because if she'd done that, if she got the notes herself and went through them, and one thing she did say, she did query the baby, the one that he mentioned there'd been foul play because there was a liver injury. She did say, I think I've read somewhere, that she queried that whether it was Dr. Breary who put a needle in trying to aspirate the abdomen, and he may have hit the liver. I think she suggested, could that have caused the injury, the laceration to the liver from the needle, which was mentioned at the first press conference. So that was one of her initial queries about that case. But later on, I don't know what happened to that. Later on, it all seems to have disappeared somehow. And then it was basically Dr. Evans suggested or hypothesized baby O had been deliberately injured in some way. I'm not sure if he actually said the baby was punched, but there was certainly no evidence for whatever he said. But I think he implied that Lucy Letby had injured the baby and caused a liver injury. So I think I'm right in saying that at the end of the day, whichever way it happened, they both agreed on the causes of these collapses and deaths, and they were the main two witnesses. I think you've said yourself it's like 90%, 95% of the whole prosecution expert evidence was based on the opinions of, probably 90% was based on Dr. Evans, and then Dr. Bowen as well. Was agreed with that.
Yeah, I'm going to just include this in a future video. But what people perhaps don't know is two things. Firstly, the medical evidence, i.e., new medical evidence from the expert witnesses, is a relatively small proportion of the court case. That's the first thing. And then of that proportion, approximately 90% of it is Bowen and Evans. Like all the other witnesses together are about 10% of the time in court.
Okay. Yeah. I know, for example, Professor Sally Kinsey, she was actually just by coincidence, she was I knew her in my medical school, but I know her contribution wasn't very much, it wasn't her fault, but she just wasn't, I know her, she was one of the experts. So yeah, so if those two were the main, by far and away, the main two experts whose evidence would help the prosecution, and for them both to agree in the way they did with Dr. Bowen, if you say it's true, I don't know if it's true that she was presented with Dr. Evans' hypotheses first before she even saw the notes. Then that's
let me be clear on this. It's in the Court of Appeal, that judgment. So
yeah. Okay, yeah. Well, that's I mean, everywhere I look at this case, there's something else pops up to make me think this is like unbelievable, and this is another one now, So yeah, so I just think the way the Dr. Evans came into the case, the way he said that to the police that they didn't need to convene the panel that the NCA had recommended with an obstetrician, a very experienced nurse, an neonatologist, and for them to accept that, it's just yet another thing that's off with the case, I think.
Yes, I agree entirely. Let's talk about the so-called stability of the infants in the case and the condition of the infants in the case,
Yeah,
and how
I
this is
think
presented in court.
Yeah, I think again with statistics, it's hard for me to be too critical because I don't know anything about statistics myself. But so there I'm saying the statisticians do know a lot about statistics, obviously, and they've got the concerns. With regard to stability, it's a similar thing for me because, as I said earlier, I haven't had access to the medical records, obviously, or the trial transcript, but or the nursing, and in the medical records, I haven't got any access to the nursing notes. So when you talk about stability, you want to know things, obviously, you want to know things like a trend. So is the baby, for example, you want to know things like the baby's temperature, respiratory rate, blood pressure, not so important, but you need to know that, and you would know that. But you need to know how much oxygen they were getting, whether they were on the ventilator or not, and about the ventilator settings. If they're breathing spontaneously or on CPAP, you want to know all the details of that. You need pulse rate, very important. Respiratory rate is really important in babies. If they're breathing spontaneously and they've got a very fast heart breathing rate, you want to know about that. But you want to know about all the blood results and all the other chest X-ray appearance. Is it improving or getting worse? So you need to have all that information. The conscious level of the baby, but it is important. But you need to know about the trend. So is it really stable? Is the pulse stable and within a normal kind of range that you'd expect for a neonate? Is the breathing rate pretty stable, or is it slowly creeping up? And if it was, or it might have been high to start with, it's coming down nicely. Oxygen requirements are coming down nicely. The chest X-rays improving, for example. Temperature's coming down. So without having all the charts and all the information from the notes, it's hard for me to say how stable they were. But what I do know is that from the looking through the various as much information as I can get, and looking through Shuli's kind of summary of the information that's gone to the CCRC, it's pretty obvious to me that it seems clear to me that the impression that Dr. Evans gave, and Dr. Bowen maybe as well, I think, gave the impression that these babies were, or some of them, most of them were pretty stable, doing well, feeding well. They were maybe off CPAP, and everything was going the right way. And then suddenly there's a collapse, a totally unexpected collapse. These babies were almost like these babies were very well, and then suddenly they collapsed, and some of them sadly died and didn't respond to resuscitation. That's the kind of impression you get. But I can't say too much about it, but the experts have said a lot more about it, and they've got access to all the records I've just discussed. So they know, looking at the notes, whether this baby's stable or not, And the one baby A, I think, when I first started looking into that, it seemed that the baby was doing quite well clinically, and then suddenly collapsed. And I thought, well, this is, in that particular case, Dr. Evans' description and Dr. Bowen probably was that the baby was doing, and then suddenly collapsed and died, So, but then the panel have come up with a thing that I would never have even thought of. They've come up that this was possibly like a kind of thrombotic episode. So a line hadn't had fluid going through it. There may have been a thrombus in the line. When the infusion was started again, that maybe has gone off and caused a brainstem stroke. And that's fairly well described, I think, that they've said. I don't know anything about that, but that would certainly cause a very sudden collapse in the way that. So that's their opinion, what happened with that baby. Dr. Evans said he thought this was an air embolism. And it seems to me, again, I might be wrong, but it seems that Dr. Evans was saying that these babies were stable, and then they suddenly collapsed with no kind of warning or no expectation that it was going to happen. And then there was this talk about skin rashes and then there's been a lot of discussion about Shooley's paper with Townswell from 1989, and that kind of backed up their suspicion that it could be an air embolism. But there was no evidence whatsoever for. You could say it's almost like you could say any patient who has a sudden collapse it could have had an air embolism, deliberate air embolism. Someone's come along and no one's looking, squirted air in. That's why they collapsed. But you don't say that because there's far more likely things, to have caused a sudden collapse than that. But Dr. Evans at one point said, quite frankly, I couldn't think of anything else. He thought, well, hang on, you might not have thought of anything else, but this expert panel certainly thought of a few other possible, more likely causes than deliberate harm. So, yeah, that's a little bit about my thoughts on stability. I can't say too much because I haven't got access to the notes. The expert panel are fairly clear in what they said, that some of these babies weren't stable at all. And the other thing Martin Pittman brought up was the fact that some of these babies were multiple birth babies, so they were twins or triplets, and the importance of if one of them had a sudden episode of collapse, it's likely that one of the other, if it's triplets, one of the others or both might have a similar thing because if they're identical, So that wasn't brought out in court, the significance of the obstetric history. I think it was mentioned, I think, but there was no real, the jury never heard about the real importance of it, which Martin was very concerned about.
Yeah, but it was barely mentioned at all.
Sorry?
It was barely mentioned at all.
Yeah. So that's it, with stability. I think some of these babies, the other thing is the babies were in a neonatal unit, they weren't at home, they were, why were they in the unit? They were there because so the nurses and the doctors could keep a close eye on them in case something like this happened, so they could deal with it. So to say it was totally unexpected, I'm not sure I agree with that either, but it just seems to me that there's been this almost, if this baby suddenly collapses, like why is air embolism being mentioned a lot? That's because if you asked many other experts, I bet they wouldn't even mention it. They would just say, they look for sepsis or some congenital heart problem maybe, or that brainstem CVA that they mentioned with baby A. That must be quite uncommon, but they would come up with things like that. They wouldn't just say this is or the baby maybe being left breathing spontaneously and they had a very high respiratory rate, and then they suddenly just collapsed and stopped breathing because they're exhausted. What an adult would tell you that you would see the breathing rates going up. They would say, I can't breathe, can't even speak, that breathless. Babies can't do all those things, so you're relying on the physical signs. So that's a bit about my thoughts on that really.
Yeah, and just to follow up on that as well, I know that you've written about a previous air embolism case with Zoe Evans.
Yeah, I think in my book, it's just a coincidence really. In my book, I wrote a chapter on mistakes, and I've wrote about some of my mistakes. And as an introduction to that chapter, I describe what I think is one of the, I think any anaesthetist would think the same. It happened in 2002 at the same hospital in Swansea where Dr. Evans worked, and it was an awful, tragic mistake made by the anaesthetist. And at the end of it was a baby, 6-week-old baby having a pyloric stenosis operation, a pyloromyotomy or Ramsted's operation. And it was in the national press. It was on the BBC News. And basically, this is a condition which usually happens in boys around the age of 4 to 6 weeks. And it's a kind of congenital thing. I don't think anyone knows why it happens, but the muscle around the outlet of the stomach, the pylorus, it becomes thickened. And the baby, eventually it gets to a stage where nothing can pass through the stomach into the duodenum and then further on into the small bowel and so on. So the baby start off with vomiting, and then it becomes projectile. So by projectile, we mean it doesn't just kind of trickle out, it literally sprays out after a feed, because the stomach's contracting away and it can't go out the normal way, so it comes back up the esophagus and the baby vomits. And sometimes when you examine the baby, you can feel a little kind of lump where this thickened swelling is, where the stomach is under the ribs. So this baby had pyloric stenosis. I've anaesthetized maybe 8 or 9, I suppose, in my career. So I haven't seen very many. Saw some at Alder Hey, and I helped anesthetize them. And then on the Isle of Man, maybe 5. That's all. So they're not very common on the. They're not that common, but. And as a general anaesthetist, which I was, we're not going to see very many of them. And nowadays, I think on the Isle of Man, they all go to Alder Hey for surgery. In fact, the last one that I was involved with, someone else had anaesthetized and it developed peritonitis. And I took the baby over to Alder Hey the next day, I remember. But anyway, in this case in Swansea, at the end of this operation, which for a surgeon, pediatric surgeon, is pretty simple procedure really for the surgeon. So you anesthetize the baby. The baby will have a nasogastric tube in, and you empty the stomach. And on the ward, the nurses might have irrigated the stomach with saline. So when you put the baby to sleep, there's nothing in the stomach, so they can't regurgitate or vomit and aspirate. The acid could go into the lungs. So you want to empty the stomach before you start. And then at the end of the op, so the surgeon makes an incision through the thickened muscle, and he goes down gently, it gradually goes deeper and deeper, and he gets down. He doesn't want to cut into the mucosa or the lining of the stomach, because then acid can leak out and the baby can get peritonitis. That's what happened with the baby I mentioned that I took over to Alder Hey. But so he does the operation, and then he asks the anaesthetist to put some air in the stomach and distend the stomach. And before he does that, he irrigates or floods the peritoneal cavity with warm saline, so the stomach is surrounded by water. And then he looks for air bubbles, so coming out of where he's made the incision. And if he sees any air bubbles, it means his incision's gone too deep and he's gone through the lining of the stomach. So then he would, if he saw the bubbles, he would suck out the warm saline. The anaesthetist would suck out the air back out the stomach, and he would repair the defect in the little tiny defect in the mucosa. He would repair that, and then that would be the end of the operation. But usually that doesn't happen. There's no air bubbles, so he knows that he hasn't got this complication. So in that case, you could close the abdomen. The baby would almost always make a good recovery, rapid recovery, and that's the end of it. Now in Swansea, at the end of that case, when the surgeon asked the anaesthetist to do that, he accidentally put the air into the intravenous line instead of the nasogastric tube. And I think he put some air in, and the surgeon was looking, and he said the stomach's not distending, so he put some more in. And then at that point, the baby suffered cardiac arrest and sadly died after about an hour of trying to resuscitate. And then the anaesthetist was charged with manslaughter. He was found not guilty eventually. But when I heard about that case and I thought about it, and I've said that in the book, I could see how that could have happened to me, because and the reason I say that is sometimes a baby's in then, I don't think it'll happen now, but in those days, I remember 1 or 2 babies coming to theatre with a nasogastric tube in, with a 3-way tap on the end of it. So they could turn the tap, inject saline into the stomach, turn it another way and aspirate the fluid back out again. And I remember a couple came up with a 3-way tap. So I don't know if that happened in this case, but in a baby, everything's obviously close together. And I think if you're not concentrating, you could just go for the wrong 3-way tap, Now, I don't know whether that was what happened here, but it did make me wonder if I thought about the cases I'd had, when they thought of putting air into the wrong 3-way tap. Anyway, this happened in Dr. Evans Hospital, and it's probably not relevant at all, but I just wondered whether this influenced his thinking about these sudden collapses, because he must have known, like everyone in the hospital, all the staff, I bet they would know about this case. It was in the papers. It would have been on the radio when the trial happened for manslaughter. That was in the press. He would have been more than aware of the devastating consequences of an air embolus, putting a few mils of air straight into the vein. So I just wondered whether, I'm not saying it happened, but it just made me wonder. It's the only case I've heard of like that, a neonate, a young baby dying from a massive air embolus, and it just happened to be in his hospital. So it just made me, I just wondered whether that had any influence on his decision making. That's all really.
Yeah, it's a very interesting episode.
Yeah, it's a horrible, horrible thing. I mean, an anaesthetist in that second, in that moment, he'd have known what was coming next. He told everyone in the theatre, I put air in the wrong place. Everyone knew what happened. He even told the parents himself. Even though he was obviously totally devastated, he went in with a colleague to tell the parents, and it's just like, one of the worst, the most awful anaesthetic disaster you could imagine, really. So he would know he was going to get suspended. The police were going to be involved, the General Medical Council, a trial. He would know in seconds what was coming,
Yeah.
So it's absolutely devastating, terrible, obviously, for the parents, but terrible for him and his family as well,
Absolutely.
So that's it. That was the thing about the air embolus.
That's very interesting. So I've got a few more questions for you. One of them is that I know that you have hopes that one of the consultants or experts from the case could possibly speak out at some point.
Yeah, it's probably totally like naive thing for me, but I just think, at the time they all seemed, they must have been, I think, convinced that there was something going on here. There was Lucy Letby was harming babies. The consultants, the police, the expert witnesses, the prosecution barrister, the jury, obviously at the end of the trial, the appeal court judges, they all must have been fairly happy that there was enough evidence to show that she was guilty of these awful crimes. But now the situation's totally changed now with Shu Lee and his panel and statisticians coming forward and obstetricians, coming forward to say that they have serious doubts about this. And then there was like the New Yorker article, the documentaries that we've seen from ITV, Channel 4, BBC. All this, all these people are coming forward, new evidence is coming up. We talked about Steve Watts before, Jane Hutton, what the kind of revelations about the way the Dr. Evans said that, he told the police he didn't feel they needed to convene the panel that we talked about earlier. All these things, one after the other, all these things are coming out. Things like it didn't really come out about the poor sanitation in the unit. And the fact that another thing, Dr. Evans changed his mind about one of the most important things in the case, which was his hypothesis that some of these babies died from excess air and milk. And he's said he doesn't think that actually happened. But the jury in the first trial, I hope I've got this right, the jury in the first trial found Lucy Letby guilty of murdering some babies by putting one or two, I think it might be three actually, from just that. One was, he said one had air down the nasogastric tube and probably excess milk and air embolism as well, I think. I'm not sure about that. But what I'm saying is the jury heard that certainly one or two babies were murdered by excess air and milk down the nasogastric tube to fill the stomach up, push the diaphragm up, and compromise breathing. Now, I think he's changed his mind on that anyway now, but that's not, the jury weren't told that, and she was found guilty. I mean, that to me, that's grounds for an appeal full stop before you need to look at anything else. But anyway, I mean, the other thing about that is I don't think, I may be wrong, but I can't think of that this has ever happened before. Yet another unprecedented thing that a neonatal nurse, or maybe any nurse, is accused of trying to kill someone by putting air down a nasogastric tube. And I think other paediatricians have said the same. You know, they've said this is just like the most ludicrous. One said it was fantastical. You know, it wouldn't happen. If you fill the stomach up, the baby would like burp and it would come up, or it would pass through into the small bowel. And it would probably be impossible to kill a baby like that anyway. And if you suspect it happens anyway with CPAP, sometimes you get air is kind of slowly forced into the stomach with the pressure of the CPAP. And if you see the abdomen distending, you just aspirate the nasogastric tube, you know, and deflate the stomach. So that was, I've lost my thread yet again. So basically, it's hard to see that. It's hard to see how that isn't a ground for appeal. You know, he told the jury one thing and now he's changed his mind. So there's a few things there, a few different issues there, but it's just all, to me, it's just all seems like there's so many kind of red flags, and the whole situation's changed now to what it was then. So out of all the people we discussed before who felt that Lucy Letby was almost certainly guilty, it's hard for me to accept that all of them still believe that in view of all the evidence we've got now to the contrary. And that's why I wonder whether one of them, or more than one, might step forward and say, look, we genuinely believe this was happening. We genuinely thought there was deliberate harm being caused to the babies, but with all the things that I've just mentioned, it's changed now. Things are different now. You know, there's so much evidence have come out through all this thing we've just talked about. We've got doubts now. You know, we haven't second thoughts about the whole thing, and I wonder whether it's we've got it completely wrong. You know. And Lucy Letby wasn't doing all the things we thought she was doing, and we've just made a mistake, you know. So that's why I keep wondering whether it's going to happen. But I just can't understand why or how they can all think that there were any crimes. That's what I can't understand why they feel like that.
Yeah,
it's a different situation completely now with what we know now. And all these people can't be burying their head in the sand and not reading anything and not watching documentaries and not glancing at Thirlwall inquiry transcripts and, you know, and watching your videos, for example. I mean, they must see some of this stuff and think, God, what have we done? You know, that's what I feel.
Yeah, absolutely. So with that in mind, can I just finally ask you to give your thoughts? We've touched upon this, but where Lucy's case stands at this point in time and what the outlook could be in the future?
Yeah, I've been corresponding with Philip Walker, who's involved with Jeremy Bamber's case. Now, we know he hasn't been exonerated yet, but he's been in prison 40 years. And I've been following that for many years. And I've been corresponding with Philip on and off for a few years and following that case. And I messaged him just a few days ago to clarify something. They've put the case to the CCRC as well. And I think they put 9 or 10 points as kind of reasons why they feel it should go back to the Court of Appeal in the similar way to Mark MacDonald has with Lucy Letby. Anyway, it's been with them for over 4 years now. And I think they've ruled on 4 of the points in 4 years. So at that rate, it could be another 5 years before they get through the whole lot, you know, and say that you know, we are going to recommend it goes back to the Court of Appeal or not. So if that's the rate of them dealing with cases like this, then it's worrying that it might take a few years. And Mark MacDonald at the meeting in Manchester kind of hinted at that as well. It's not going to happen in the next few months, or maybe not even in the next year or two. So that's a concern for me. I'm worried about that. About the length of time it's going to take for the CCRC to work their way through this. But you interviewed Anna Doherty a few weeks ago, and I agree with not because she said it. I thought the same thing as her. At the end of it, you asked her what she thought, and I think she said she was quite optimistic, about Lucy Letby getting a retrial. And I feel the same because of all the things I've been saying, about how much evidence there is now showing that this is just the most clear-cut, obvious miscarriage of justice, maybe not ever, but one of the most clear-cut cases you could imagine could ever happen. So I feel the same as her. I'm optimistic that, Mark MacDonald's, I've heard him say he's not going to give up. He's going to go on. You've said the same thing. Mark, I didn't realise till recently that Mark MacDonald is doing all this work for Lucy Letby for free, and saw all the panel. I knew that from what Julie said at the second press conference. These people aren't going to stop. They're going to go on and they're going to do all they can to get justice for Lucy Letby. So I think I can't believe the CCRC are going to look at this and then say, we don't buy any of this. It's not new evidence. There's nothing new for the Court of Appeal. We think the convictions are safe. I just can't see how that could possibly happen. And if it goes back to the Court of Appeal, again, I don't want to try and show off and pretend I'm not a lawyer. It's just my opinion from what I've from what I've seen and read about. But I don't see how the Court of Appeal can look at this and just say, well, we all know how reluctant the Court of Appeal are to admit mistakes. And I said before about, they never seem to apologise either on behalf of. It's not their fault, but on behalf of the whole system, the whole judicial system, apologise for ruining the lives of these people who've had miscarriages of justice. So I don't see how.
I just want to mention something. So in the case of Ian Watkins, who is this singer who's now dead,
I know about that. Yeah,
they prosecuted his girlfriend.
I know about that.
So she was trying to get the police
to
understand who he was, that we now know to be true.
Yeah.
And they prosecuted her. Of course, she was found not guilty, thankfully for her. They never apologised. If you look at the statement at the end, they don't say, "Oh, we're sorry for prosecuting this person who was trying to outline the terrible crimes of this other person." They just say, "Oh, we're happy with the fact we prosecuted her. We were entitled to do that." They're just, it's embarrassing. It's embarrassing.
It's not the same thing. But if you're in any job or if you make a mistake or anything in life generally, like say a doctor, you make a mistake and you go and say to the patient, "Look, I'm sorry, but I've made a mistake." As an example, I anaesthetized a man who happened to be an old friend of mine. I hadn't seen him for a few years, and I made a mistake during the anaesthetic. I thought it was reasonable to give the anaesthetic a certain way. And then he had a complication of that. And I remember telling his family, they came in with a friend of theirs. And I remember saying, "Look, I made I made a mistake here." He was okay at the end. He went to ITU and then he was all right. But I felt terrible about it. But I told him straight away, and like many doctors would do the same, they say, "We made a mistake here, I'm sorry." And if the worst happens and it all goes so wrong and the family complain about you, then that's just you have to deal with that. But to not apologise when you've made a horrendous mistake. One of my worst nightmares is the thought of being put in prison for even just for a month or so. If you're innocent, it must be horrific.
Awful.
And even worse, if one of my daughters ended up like that. So Lucy's parents having to go and see her in prison And at the moment, she's going to die in prison, maybe 40, 50 years down the line. So it's like a worst nightmare, really, but one of your worst nightmares. But having said all that, I think I'm optimistic that she's going to be exonerated, but I just hope it doesn't take too long. I hope she's not still sitting there in 3 years' time and we still haven't even got back to the Court of Appeal. That's my
Yeah,
main concern. I mean,
yeah.
I thought I was hoping in the very first press conference, Mark McDonald hinted that there's a possibility that the appeal court might not order a retrial. They can just quash the conviction. That's the impression I got. And I
Yeah.
was hoping that would happen, but that hasn't been really discussed much since.
Well, he said in Manchester they would push for a retrial, didn't he? The
He did
prosecution.
say that, sorry, he did. Yeah.
Mm.
So I was kind of a bit disheartened when I heard that, but
Well, I don't think it's inevitable, personally.
yeah,
I think the CPS will face massive embarrassment whatever happens because
yeah,
they,
yeah,
they
I think,
either will have to say we can't raise a court
yeah,
case
yeah.
to go in court for a retrial, or they'll have to sit through the retrial and be annihilated.
Yeah, I don't see, I mean, again, I don't know much, but I don't see how there could be another case
I
because
don't really.
I don't think any expert witness
No.
would come forward to offer any evidence that would support the prosecution. I just can't see
No.
it. And then we've got all of Shuley's panel; they're all raring to go, and I'm
I
sure
mean,
there's many more.
it would be truly embarrassing for the system if there was a retrial. The retrial would be an absolute embarrassment for them. The thing is, though, if they say we can't even take it to court, that's embarrassing for them as well. So
It is.
I can't make any predictions about what will happen, but I also can't see how there can be a retrial.
Yeah, I don't think. I mean, the other thing is the whole system is again. This is just my opinion, but I think the whole judicial system is just awful, really. The whole thing's not just the fact the judges, the appeal court judges don't apologize. I'm talking about the whole system. It's
Yeah.
the CCRC taking forever to make a decision. The minuscule amount of cases they send back to the appeal court anyway. It's terrible, really. This whole case to me sums up the many flaws in the judicial system.
Mm.
And I think what Jerry Conlon and Paddy Hill said when we released it outside the Old Bailey, they said what they thought of the judicial system then. And I think it's no better now than it was then, personally. And it was awful then. So that's just my personal opinion. But being on the receiving end of some of the bad things about it, like Lucy Letby has been, it must be, it's terrible, isn't to think that if you're completely innocent, and you talk about red flags before, like as far as I know, all of her colleagues, nursing colleagues, the senior nurses, the senior managers at the hospital, I'm pretty sure they're all convinced she's innocent still, even though they went to the Thirlwall inquiry, some of them, and kind of almost towed the party line that she's guilty.
Well, that's
I mean, they went in there and, they were kind of, that whole inquiry to me is another very odd thing because people were going in there and she'd already warned about noise, as she called us, Lady Justice Thirlwall. So they were all kind of, I mean, you talked about the report from the college before, the College of Pediatrics and Child Health. They start off their report for the Thirlwall inquiry by apologising to the family. That's fair enough. But then they apologise to the doctors for all the distress and the upset, that's been caused by the actions of Lucy Letby. Well, hang on a minute. Yeah. So they're saying that. What about the upset that's been caused to Lucy Letby?
mm.
And when their life ruined, if she's innocent. Now, so they're saying that the whole premise of the inquiry is that she's guilty. That's it. And she has been convicted. That doesn't mean she is guilty. She was convicted. But no miscarriage of justice is they all get convicted, but it doesn't mean they're guilty. So that's another kind of thing that people have been going there and kind of acting in a certain way
Mm.
where deep down, I don't think some of them believed what they were actually saying. They're just saying it they didn't want to upset the families, the parents. They didn't want to upset the barristers or the
Yeah,
chair of the inquiry. So the whole things are just an absolute mess, I think.
yeah, that's absolutely true.
So
Yeah, I mean that's absolutely true. We'll just have to wait and see what
yeah,
happens with that. Well, but
yeah.
that's a good place to leave the interview today. Thank you so much for joining us and giving all your thoughts and
Thanks very much,
experience.
Chris.
It's been brilliant.
Thanks very
And,
much.
yeah, we'll just as you know, we're in touch. So if we feel you can come on again in the future, it'd be nice to have you on again. But really appreciate you speaking to me today.
Thanks very much, Chris.
Yeah, no worries.
Thanks.